Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you guys today. I was told I only had an hour and 27 minutes with you. Oh, wait, 27 minutes. I'm sorry. And I got a lot of ground to cover. I once heard a Baptist preacher say that he felt like a mosquito at a nudist colony. He had so much ground to cover. I figure if a Baptist preacher can say it, I can too, right? So one of the things that I'm going to try to do for the next half hour or so is to honor the promise made in the program, which is to help you see the opportunities around you. I'm going to do that by sharing with you some stories and some principles from a book that I wrote with John Stonestreet called Restoring All Things. God's audacious plan to change the world through everyday people. You know, one of the key ideas of this book is that the reason the world changes, the reason cultures change is typically not from places like Washington, D.C., at the top of culture, Hollywood, New York. I mean, sure, there's a big impact by those organizations and those places on our lives. But it's also, I would say that it's not the main impact on our culture. It's also not from the rugged individualist, which is sort of what the American myth is all about, right? I mean, you've got the John Waynes of the world, if you will, who sort of go out into the West and or go out into the frontier or, whatever that dark, dangerous place is. But what Alexis de Tocqueville said in Democracy in America in the 1840s was that the reason America was strong was because America was strong in the middle. And what he meant by that was that those organizations that have sometimes come to be called the institutions of civil society, what Alexis de Tocqueville called the mediating institutions of our society and of our culture, rooted first and foremost in the family and in the church. So in Restoring All Things, what John Stonestreet and I wanted to do was to tell stories of individuals and organizations that were having those kinds of positive impacts, culture-changing impacts on their local communities, and then to highlight how that impact was having a much larger impact globally as that impact was rippling out or as it was being replicated by others who were seeing what was going on. We begin our book, Restoring All Things, with an observation about the Bible. And that observation is this, that the Bible is full of rewords. Those of you that have ever read the Bible know that. There are lots of words like redeem, renew, restore, resurrect, reconcile, and regenerate in the Bible. By the way, that's a picture of John Stonestreet, my co-author there, and the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. However, there are some other rewords in the Bible, and I would say that unfortunately, these are the words that Christians too often focus on. They're words like resist, rebuke, react, and reject. Now, don't get me wrong. We live in a broken world, and we're going to say a little bit more about that brokenness later in my presentation. And there are times when we as Christians absolutely have to stand against evil in the world. And I'm not denigrating that or saying that shouldn't be a part of what our Christian vocation should be as citizens and as leaders in our culture. But I think we would probably do better off most of the time if we would focus more on those rewords on the left-hand side of the page rather than on the right-hand side of the page. And that brings me to the first key idea that I want to share with you today. And that is that I think that Christians must be known more by what we are for than by what we are against. You know, this is an absolutely scriptural idea. If you look at Philippians 4:8, you read this: finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, let's think about these things. Philippians 4:8. Sometimes these ideas in Philippians 4:8 get reduced to these ideas: the good, the true, and the beautiful. What are the good, the true, and the beautiful aspects of our lives, aspects of culture that we can create and celebrate? You know, Michelangelo, the great painter, an artist of all kinds, once said, when I want to criticize, I create something beautiful. Throughout history, the Christian church has been known as the creative force in culture. It has been known as living out the Imago Dei, being made in the image of God, who was first and foremost a creator. In fact, the first things we learn about God in the Bible is this: in the beginning, God what? God created the heavens and the earth, and we're made in his image. We're to be creators as well. And that's why Restoring All Things really celebrates creative work in addressing poverty, economics, entrepreneurship, defending life, and a whole realm of other areas that you can see here on the screen. And of course, we do talk about some famous people like Chuck Colson. Chuck was a mentor of mine. I had the privilege of getting to know him in the last few years of his life. And of course, he's the namesake of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, where I now have the privilege of serving. So we tell stories about of people like Chuck in Prison Fellowship, but we also tell stories of men like Bruce Strom. Bruce Strom is an attorney. He was involved in a church. He would show up at church on Sundays, and people who knew he was an attorney because he was active in that community would come to him and ask him questions, legal questions. And Bruce realized that not only was there a great need in his church for people who couldn't afford legal help, but it was also a great outreach for the church as well. So on Tuesday nights, he would set up a table at his church and invite people to come and just ask legal questions, absolutely free. Pro bono is what the lawyers call that. And that eventually grew into a very large ministry called Administer Justice. And Bruce now is replicating that ministry around the country. And he's written a book recently called Gospel Justice, which explains what he's doing and how other lawyers can do this in their churches all around the country. Bruce is an example of what we call grass tops leaders. You've heard of grassroots leaders, right? And then you've heard of the elite. But what about the people that are active in their local communities? We call those grass tops leaders in the book. And again, it's because what Alexis de Tocqueville said is that we're strong because of the mediating institutions of culture. Not what happens in Washington or what happens at the bottom, but what happens in communities just like this all across America. You know, one of the stories that we tell in this book that I'm particularly fond of is a story of Kent Twitchell. Kent Twitchell, by the way, this is a picture I took with Ken in his downtown LA studio, a couple of pictures, and I want to direct your attention to the picture on the right, because I'm going to show you a different picture of that in a minute. This is Kent working on a huge mural. Kent is what is known as the godfather of the LA mural movement. If any of you have ever been to Los Angeles and driven the streets there, you'll know that there are large murals on the sides of buildings all over LA. Well, this started with Kent Twitchell back in the 1960s. And by the way, that's the picture of that mural completed and posted on the side of a building in Los Angeles. You can get a sense of the scale there. That's about 40 feet tall. Well, Kent started doing this because as an artist, he was just looking for an alley. By the way, he's a deeply committed Christian. And he started painting these murals all across Los Angeles, sort of proclaiming the glory of God using the gifts that he had. This is a mural of Jesus on the side of a building at Biola University, a Christian college in Southern California. But Kent doesn't just paint on the sides of Christian buildings. This is the very first mural that Kent ever painted. And the mural is, do y'all know who this is? Anyone? Yeah, it's Steve McQueen. Yeah, exactly right. It's the actor Steve McQueen. And Kent painted this in the 1960s, sort of in the height of Steve McQueen's fame. And there's something particularly interesting about this mural. Notice Steve McQueen's eyes are particularly sort of flaming. And people always comment about Steve McQueen's eyes in this painting. And Kent said he did that intentionally. He wanted Steve McQueen to look like Moses looked whenever he came down off of Mount Sinai. Wanted to see that fire in his eyes. And he wanted people to see that fire and ask about it. So this is an interesting painting of someone. It's a secular pop culture icon, but because Kent brought his Christian worldview to this painting, people all across Los Angeles are talking about God, or talking about Moses, or talking about the glory of God in those eyes. By the way, Kent painted this whenever he was still an art student, and he painted it because the folks who owned that house went away on vacation and said Kent could live in his house if they would paint their house while they were gone on vacation. So whenever he came home, they found this. And of course, this was not exactly what the owners had in mind, but they loved it so much that they didn't paint over it. And I'm glad they didn't, and so many people are too. This is another artist, and I'm not going to dwell on artists today, but again, I want to traffic on this theme that I've started here on being creative, because I think we are all creative. We're all made in the image of God to be creative ourselves. This is Masato Fujimura, and Masato is not only an artist, but he's also an organization leader as well. He's created an organization called the International Arts movement, which is an organization of Christians that are engaged in the arts all across the world. Masato does what is sometimes called post-expressionist or abstract expressionist painting. He's now with the at Fuller Seminary in California, where he leads the Bream Center on art and culture for that seminary. But one of the reasons I wanted to highlight Masato is because Masato has this wonderful saying that I'm fond of quoting: artists are often like the shepherds of Bethlehem. They are the first to see the miracles around us. That's the gift fundamentally of the artist. They see things before the rest of us see things, and they're able to incarnate those things that they see in ways that the rest of us who don't have their gift are now able to see it too. And I think that to a certain extent, that really explains the giftedness that God gives each of us in our vocations. Whether you're an engineer, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a school teacher, you see something in other people or in your work that other people don't. And it is your duty and privilege and joy and responsibility to help bring that alive. In other words, in some ways, we're all artists because we were made in the image of God, the creator of the universe, to be creative ourselves in whatever vocation God has called us to. You know, I focused on a couple of artists, but I know most of you here today are business people, so I wanted to make mention of at least one business person before we moved along, and that is Jimmy Lin. This is a picture of Jimmy Lin from the TED website. Some of you may be familiar with the TED Talks. Jimmy Lin was a TED Fellow and a TED speaker. Some of you also may be familiar with this verse in James. I believe it's James 1:27. This is true religion, pure and undefiled in God's sight, to look after widows and orphans in their time of need. Y'all know that verse? Have you heard it before, right? Well, when Jimmy heard that verse, Jimmy, by the way, is a biologist and a biochemist, he heard that verse in a very different way, because in his world, there are orphan drugs and orphan diseases. And one of the things that Jimmy Lin knew about these orphan diseases is that if you've got AIDS or if you've got cancer, there are billions of dollars being thrown at research into those diseases because there are a lot of people who are afflicted by those diseases. However, there are thousands of orphan diseases all across America that in some cases afflict as few as a few dozen people, but mostly afflict in the thousands of people. They never get any research, but they cause tremendous suffering for the people who have those diseases and tremendous isolation for the families and communities that have to deal with those diseases. So Jimmy sort of applied James 1:27 in a very unique way. He was going to adopt orphan diseases and use technology, crowdsourcing technology in particular, to find solutions to those diseases. So he has created these platforms called that you can find on the nonprofit website Rare Genomics Institute, and he comes up with therapies and treatments and funds research into these orphan diseases. Thousands and thousands of people have been helped because of Jimmy Lin being creative and applying his vocation of biochemistry to a scriptural verse that he heard in a different way because of his particular giftedness. Now, one of the things that I've done, I hope you've noticed in the first few minutes that I've been with you, is that I've employed a particular strategy in sharing this idea, with some of the ideas with you. And that strategy is a strategy of storytelling. I've told you stories of individuals. And that's the second key point that I want to make with you today, is that not only must we be known more by what we are for than by what we are against, but we must also recover the art of storytelling if we want to have an impact in our culture. You know, I first sort of came across this idea many years ago because I'm an English major and I have an undergrad in journalism and a master's in English. So I've been sort of drawn to storytelling my whole life. But it was Andrew Peterson, the musician and novelist, whenever we were doing a tour rolling out Restoring. By the way, any of you know Andrew Peterson? You know his music? Any of you? Yeah, a few of you do. Really fantastic. And so Andrew was really generous to come with us on our tour when we rolled out Restoring All Things. And one of the things that Andrew Peterson would always say when he got on stage to sing a few songs was that if you want someone to hear the truth, you should tell them the truth. But if you want someone to love the truth, you should tell them a story. Storytelling is the way we resonate with abstract ideas. You know, this, again, is not a new idea. Damon of Athens, who was a great philosopher and musicologist in the Greek era, said this, that if you give me the songs of a people, I care not who writes its laws. And of course, in Damon's era, the songs were the stories. Now, those of us who are Christians shouldn't be surprised by this, right? Jesus himself was a storyteller. Mark 4:34 says that Jesus did not speak to them except in parables. In other words, except in stories. You know, I often speak to high school and college age students, and when I do, I make the point about the importance of storytelling often in this way. I will put this mathematical symbol on the screen and ask the students, do you know what this symbol is? And it's not a trick question, the number's on the screen, right? What is this? Yeah, this is the mathematical symbol pi. If you've had even basic mathematics, you know that pi is 3.14. But if you've had maybe slightly more advanced mathematics, you know that it is not 3.14. Pi is what is known as an irrational number. In other words, it is an infinite number that does not repeat in its series. Now, if I said we're gonna spend the 30 minutes after I talk during your roundtable time memorizing pi to 150 decimal points, yeah, most of you would laugh or roll your eyes or you know, check your messages during that break. But if I say to you, do you know your 10-digit phone number? A lot of you would say, yeah, I know my 10-digit phone number. Do you know your home phone number, which is also 10 digits? Maybe your wife's or your husband's phone number or your kid's phone number. You say, yeah, I know those numbers. I've probably got 10, 20, 30, 40 numbers tucked away. You know, close people that are near and dear to me, in my life that I've memorized. Absolutely. Well, do you know your social security number? I know mine. I've got 4 children, and because my wife is usually the one that takes them to school and to the doctor, she has seen a necessity of memorizing all of my kids' social security numbers plus my own. So that's 6 times 9, which is how many digits? Yeah, 54 digits, right? So, you know, she's memorized those. So all of a sudden we begin to realize the year of our birth, the year of our marriage, the year that our kids were born, maybe even with the month and the day transposed in there as well. We have not only dozens, but scores, perhaps even hundreds of digits cataloged away in our mind that we can recall instantly. What's the difference between memorizing pi to 150 decimal points and all of these numbers that I've just mentioned to you that you've already got memorized in your head? Well, the answer is that there's a story behind every one of the numbers that you have memorized. Stories help us to remember abstract ideas by providing relevance and concepts and context for these abstract ideas. And this is important for us as Christians because as Christians, we are called not to impose our values on a culture, but to propose our ideas on a culture, as Chuck Colson once said. So being able to tell stories is a very powerful way to win, not to win arguments in the moment, but to win hearts and minds over time. And if you don't believe this, just consider this short story. In 1996, a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, signed the Defense of Marriage Act, a bipartisan law that said that marriage was between one man and one woman. That was 1996. A Democrat signed that bill into law. However, in 1998, a television show debuted on network TV. Some of you may know this program, Will and Grace, 1998. By the year 2000, it was the #1 situation comedy on TV, and it maintained that place until about 2004. It finally went off the air in 2008. Joe Biden said that the program Will and Grace had more to do with America embracing the LGBT agenda and same-sex marriage than all the activism of the groups that were designed to advocate for the LGBT agenda. A situation comedy on television. In fact, there are now artifacts from this television show in the LGBTQIA, did I leave out any? Exhibit at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Storytelling is a powerful tool for affecting people's hearts and minds. In fact, Todd Gerlin, in a book called In the Twilight of Common Dreams, wrote this: while the right was marching towards the White House in the 1960s and 70s, the left was marching on the English department. We both achieved our goals by 1980, right? We had a conservative Republican in the White House, And the left, though, had virtually every college in America under its sway. And of course, we now see where we are 35 years later. That's why Robert Weber, a theologian late of Wheaton College, he recently passed away, said this: the most pressing spiritual issue of our time is who gets to narrate the world? Who gets to tell the story of the world? Is it going to be us or is it going to be someone else? Thirdly, if we're going to tell the story, we need to tell the complete story. I think Christians do a really good job of telling what I call the first 3 chapters of the biblical story. Those first 3 chapters are the creation, the fall, and redemption. We're really good at telling those stories. The evangelical movement has been great at saying that we're sinners in need of a Savior. Jesus is that Savior, and He will save you from your sins, save you from hell, and save you ultimately for eternal life. But what about the 4th chapter of the story, the chapter that most of the New Testament is concerned with, and that is the restoration of all things? I think it's important, in other words, for us to ask not just what we are saved from, but what are we saved for as Christians? What are we saved for? Well, the Bible is pretty explicit about that. What we are saved for, we have been reconciled to God so that we can be reconcilers ourselves. We've become friends with God so that we can love our neighbors as ourselves. 2 Corinthians 5:18. And that means that, and this is the 4th key point that I want to share with you today, in a broken world, a world like we live in today, we as Christians have to not separate from that brokenness, but we have to run towards that brokenness. We have to, in other words, run towards the plague. What Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we must come out into the tempest of the living. And what does it mean to run towards the plague? In fact, where does that expression even come from? Well, it comes, and we count this story in Restoring All Things, it comes from the plague of Cyprian. By the way, if you've never read Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, I strongly recommend that book. This story plays a pivotal role in that book, and we have recounted it in our book as well. The plague of Cyprian took place around 250 AD when the Christian church was still very marginalized, very small in the Roman Empire and in the Western world generally. There was just a terrible plague that took place, and many, many people who could afford it fled the cities for the countryside. There's one group, however, who did not flee. Do you know what group that was? It's Christians. Christians stayed in the cities where the plagues were the worst, and they nursed and they cared for their neighbors, many of whom were pagans, many of whom were not Christians. And of course, it was a tremendous sacrifice to do that. Many of these Christians who cared for their neighbors, who loved their neighbors as themselves, died of the plague themselves. But an amazing thing happens, Rodney Stark says. Within a generation or two after the end of the plague of Cyprian, Christianity had spread largely because of the witness of sacrifice made by those folks who ran towards the plague throughout the Western world. And of course, we know about from there the rise of Christendom and the great achievements of Christianity in Western culture after the plague of Cyprian, from about 300 all the way up to the Reformation and beyond. So we as Christians, we have to run towards the plague. Well, if we do that, and I'm coming down to my final points here, and if you were going to go make a difference in your communities, what would that look like to you, for you, with you, in your particular vocation? In Restoring All Things, we pose 4 questions. And by the way, my email address will be at the end of this presentation. If you'd like a copy of these slides, I'd be glad to share them with you. It's only about a 4 megabyte file. So just send me an email, say, Warren, send me your slides, and I'll do that. But real quickly, let me go through these questions. What is good in our culture that we can promote, protect, and celebrate? What is missing that we can creatively contribute? What is evil in our culture that we can stop? And what is broken in our culture that we can restore? These are 4 questions that we pose near the beginning of Restoring All Things that we are asking our readers to ask themselves as they read through the stories that we recount in that book. And they're also the questions that I would ask you today to ask yourselves as you try to ask and answer that question. how can I make a difference in my community? Not by quitting what I'm doing and going off to the mission field, but by treating your business where you are today as that mission field that God has called you to. In other words, the question that I would ask you, and this is my final story, if you will, is what does it mean to be a fire bearer in your community? Now, you may be asking yourself, what is a fire bearer? Let me tell you this quick story in closing. In the city of Ephesus in the first century, there was a huge temple there, a pagan temple. It was to the god Artemis. And the temple of Artemis had a perpetual flame in there, and it was tended by the temple priest. Now, if you lived in Ephesus and your fire went out in your home, that was a big deal because it was the way you cooked, it was the way you warmed your home, it was the sort of the symbol of safety and protection and hearth and home, right? So if your fire went out, it was a big deal. What were you supposed to do if your fire went out? Well, you were supposed to take a bowl, a ceramic bowl, and a tribute, money, some sort of tangible financial support, and go to the temple of Artemis, and the priest who tended the fire in the temple would give you hot coals. And you would leave your tribute, and then you would go back to your home and you would replenish your fire. The temple priest taught that if you got your fire anywhere else, you would offend the gods. It was a bad thing. And of course, there was also a self-interest there as well, right? That's how the temple priests made their money, was by basically selling this fire to people whose fires had gone out. However, the Christians in Ephesus thought differently. They would go around walking the streets, praying for their neighbors, praying for the folks who particularly didn't have fire. Their fires had gone out. And whenever they noticed someone whose fire had gone out, they would take their own ceramic bowls, fill them with hot coals, and take them to their neighbors. This was a very powerful statement. Think about that. Not only did it meet a very real physical need, but it also made a powerful theological statement as well. It basically said, we are not afraid of the temple priest. We are not afraid of the god of Artemis because the God we serve is greater than the God they serve. In other words, it was an act of benevolence that had powerful theological implications. I tell that story again to ask this question in closing. What does it mean for us to be a fire bearer in our culture today? What is it that we can do that is an act of real service to our neighbors that also makes a powerful theological statement that says our God is a great God, and motivated by our love for Him, we serve you? I hope some of the things I've shared with you today will help you answer that question. Again, my email address is on the screen. If you'd like to, if you didn't have time to jot down all the stuff on the slides, you can just jot down my email address, send me an email, I'll be glad to send them to you. God bless you. Thank you very much. It's been a joy to serve you and to share with you today. Thank you.